My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the How to Disaster podcast, Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the CEO of After the Fire. On today's episode, I'm happy to welcome George Laws Garcia from the Mersonia Group. The Mersonia Group is an advocacy group that helps clients develop public policy that is innovative and effective. George has a wealth of experience managing natural disaster emergencies from Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, and we're excited to bring his knowledge to you. I invited George to be on the podcast today because I was interested in his work, in particular with Puerto Rico, and how to serve and advocate for that community in the midst of the worst disaster in their recorded history, Hurricane Maria. It was also during a very difficult time politically for Puerto Rico, and politics entered into the space of disaster. So we're going to talk about that today, how to work around that. And he's going to bring you his incredible experience and knowledge being a fierce advocate for Puerto Rico. So welcome to the podcast, George Laws Garcia. Once again, welcome to the podcast, George Laws Garcia. Thank you for being on.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to have you on for a lot of reasons. You have a very interesting background sort of navigating politics and disaster. So I'm hoping that you can start off by telling us about your current position, and then I'm going to ask you about your disaster story.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Currently, I am the founder and principal of Mersonia Group. We are a boutique lobbying, public policy, and consulting firm, and we work on a variety of different issues related to federal policy. But a lot of it is connected to both disaster issues and Puerto Rico because of my background. And my background specifically, I've had over 15 years in public service. I've worked for national nonprofit organizations focused on federal public policy issues between Puerto Rico and the federal government. I've been an advisor to two governors of Puerto Rico in their Washington, D.C. office that interfaces with the federal executive branch as well as with Congress. And I worked at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and I also advised Puerto Rico's member of Congress for about 4 years.
So Puerto Rico sits in a very sort of a unique position. Can you talk to us about your relationship with Puerto Rico?
Definitely. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. We've been a territory for 123 years. And what that means is that for a lot of different issues, Puerto Rico is treated differently than the states, even though the people of Puerto Rico are natural born United States citizens. So we're under the U.S. flag, we follow U.S. federal law, we're subject to it, but at the same time, we don't have full voting representation in Congress, and Congress does treat us unequally in a number of different federal laws and programs. And that is something that became incredibly important in the post-disaster period after Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017 when I was in public service, because your members of Congress are your front line of defense to basically articulate the needs of the jurisdiction in front of the federal officials that are allocating the resources for post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. And in the case of Puerto Rico, we have no representation in the U.S. Senate. So we had to depend on senators from other states to do that advocacy work on our behalf. And we only have one non-voting member of Congress, which is called a resident commissioner, as opposed to having a delegation of, 4 or 5 representatives, which is what a state with a population like Puerto Rico normally has. So it creates a huge challenge when it comes to actually making sure that the needs of 3.2 million United States citizens, the overwhelming majority of which are Hispanic, are actually, properly attended to by Congress. And then on top of it all, we don't get to vote for president of the United States. So the federal executive, doesn't have as much focus on Puerto Rico as it would when a disaster happens in another state where there are a lot of electoral college votes, like Florida or Texas, which were also hit by major disasters that very same year of 2017 and received significantly different treatment than Puerto Rico.
And politics really did enter into it. And we saw it because our money was actually coupled at one point from our 2017 disaster, which happened about a month after yours. And so some of our federal dollars were actually coupled with Puerto Rico. And because the issue of Puerto Rico is so political, and I want to get a little more into that, it meant that we actually had to get our funds uncoupled because yours were being held hostage.
Yeah.
And so even though we were happy to have our money, we were also like, that seems entirely wrong. I've sat with Kevin McCarthy when he has said politics has no place in disaster. And so I would really like to see that play out for both parties and the executive office as well. But I'm hearing more about more support for Puerto Rico becoming a state. Where is that in the process right now? And what are the barriers too?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, Puerto Rico's been part of the United States for 123 years. We've fought in the U.S. military since World War I. We've made countless contributions. There's about $70 billion worth of interstate commerce between Puerto Rico and the States. So our economies are fundamentally intertwined. And nowadays, there's 3.2 million Puerto Ricans on the island, but there's 5 million Puerto Ricans living stateside in pretty much every state across the country. There is a population of Puerto Ricans. So what's happening is that it has become absolutely clear that the current territory status is unable to provide for Puerto Rico's continued economic development and progress. And as a result, in large part of the unequal treatment of Puerto Rico under federal laws and programs, Puerto Rico accumulated a huge amount of debt trying to kind of keep up with the standard of living in other states. And we ended up in federal bankruptcy. And as opposed to Congress actually addressing the root cause of the issue, which is territorial inequality, lack of representation, and a lack of opportunity to actually have a voting voice in the Congress that would make sure that Puerto Rico's priorities are included and addressed when the federal government legislates. They passed a law that allowed us to do debt restructuring, which is called PROMESA, but it imposed a fiscal oversight board over Puerto Rico, where 7 unaccountable members basically are able to dictate Puerto Rico's fiscal policy. So Puerto Rico actually retroceded in terms of the amount of self-government that it had, and all of that happened in 2016. So when the hurricane hit, it actually had a direct impact on our recovery process, because the federal government was not just dealing with the government of Puerto Rico, but on top of that, you had to negotiate with the oversight board, which then had to redo a fiscal plan and figure out, where could the resources for the recovery be, allocated in a way that made sense with our fiscal recovery. So all of that has made it absolutely clear to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico that territory status is unviable. And as a result, there's been a series of votes, first one in 2012, then another one in 2017, immediately before the hurricanes, and then the most recent one in 2020, in which each time the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico have rejected continuing under the current territory status and supported statehood as their preferred option among the non-territory options that are constitutionally viable. So the last vote was in 2020, and we had 52% say yes to statehood in a very simple statehood yes or no vote. And Congress is currently considering legislation to advance that issue and resolve Puerto Rico's current territory status. And I'm actually very actively involved in supporting the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act, which is one of the 2 pieces of legislation that Congress is considering right now.
Can you talk about the legacy of colonialism, though, which is still present in the current structure, but how that actually ends up impacting Puerto Rico's ability to have any resiliency in the face of great disaster? And we saw that with the electrical grid system in particular. Can you go into that?
Well, the legacy of colonialism is very clear in that When the United States acquired Puerto Rico in 1898, it did so for geostrategic military purposes. It wanted to have a protection against the projection of military power by Europe, particularly to the Panama Canal, which was the main thoroughway for transoceanic commerce that the United States had to connect the East Coast with the West Coast, right? And Puerto Rico provided a perfect platform to be able to kind of shield that American investment and also project power out into the Atlantic. But Puerto Rico was also acquired as a captive market for the sale of U.S. Goods and services, right? So at the time there wasn't the World Trade Organization and all the free trade agreements there are now. So having a colony was about being able to get something out of it and then also sell them your stuff, right? And then the reality is that the way the federal government has treated Puerto Rico under federal laws, even after the granting of United States citizenship, has been unequally across a number of different, federal laws and programs. So for some things we're domestic, for some things we are international, like federal tax law, right? But then what ends up happening is that it leads to a systemic underinvestment in key both hard infrastructure like electric grids, roads, bridges, telecommunications, etc. And then it also leads to a huge underinvestment in soft infrastructure, which is education system, healthcare, etc. And as a result, when the hurricanes Irma and Maria hit, we had a total power outage across the entirety of the island. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, basically had 100% failure rate across the island, and it was devastating. That ended up being the number one factor that led to over 2,800, close to 3,000 excess deaths as a result of the hurricane. So while some people died from injuries sustained during the hurricane or collapses of infrastructure, those tended to be like relatively small. But a huge number of the people who died, which probably wouldn't have died if we hadn't had the hurricane, they died because their electricity was out and they didn't have the access to transportation to get them to the healthcare that they needed, or they were elderly people, their ventilators or other medical equipment wasn't functioning, their refrigerators for their medicines weren't operating. So it was pretty devastating. So that inequality that happens under colonialism creates a structural vulnerability that becomes exacerbated and highlighted, and basically the mask was taken off of the situation in Puerto Rico when the hurricane happened.
And I think that a lot of people, when they hear the legacy of colonialism, they think it's something from so long ago, or they look at Central or in South America too, and they say, well, I don't get it, why they can't why it's messy in certain places, or why their infrastructure isn't that good. What they have to know is that any infrastructure put in place was put in place for the most efficient way to extract natural resources. And and that is not necessarily the best way, of course, to build or maintain an infrastructure that will sustain the population that lives there, especially when people then left. And if you don't have an economy that can support infrastructure, which is so expensive and so necessary, so it leads to a lot of systemic issues. And with Puerto Rico, that was just really painful. Yes, the mask fell, but the mask needed to fall. So if there was any good that came out of that, it was that people couldn't delude themselves anymore.
And that's definitely true. And we saw that in the data afterwards. As horrible as it may seem, the fact that the hurricanes happened helped to increase the awareness among the American public that Puerto Ricans are American citizens. We're part of the United States. Before the hurricane, I think the statistics show that about 35 to 45% of American households were aware that the people of Puerto Rico are United States citizens and that we're Americans. And after the hurricane, that went up to, 80 some 90%. I'm sure over time it will go back down again, which is precisely why it's so important that we not only execute a proper disaster recovery, but that we also address the underlying issue of legal and constitutional inequality because of the colonial territory status.
Yeah, no taxation without representation, right?
That's
I
true.
mean, that's like fundamentally American. So,
Yep.
so I would like you to tell us your disaster story. Take us back to 2017, and where were you, and how did your family fare, and your home, and all of those. Tell us your story.
So, 2017 was possibly one of the hardest years of my life. And I sit here today in 2021. But if I think back to that moment, the hairs in my arm get raised because there's just a lot of emotion associated with it. I was serving at the time as the deputy director of the Washington, D.C. office of the governor of Puerto Rico. So I wasn't physically located in Puerto Rico. And we had two back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes. Hurricane Irma, which came first and grazed Puerto Rico's northwest portion. There was an island municipality, Vieques, that was heavily impacted. There was power outages throughout the island, but within a few days, most of the power had been restored. And then less than 2 weeks later, we got hit by Hurricane Maria. And Hurricane Maria had been a Category 5. It just downgraded before hitting Puerto Rico, but it was a very powerful Category 4, which is incredibly devastating in terms of the speed of the wind, the amount of water that came. And it crossed through the center of the island from one end to the other diagonally. And that meant that there wasn't a single inch of Puerto Rico that was not heavily impacted by the hurricane. In Washington, D.C., our office essentially went, from one day being a operation that mostly focused on public policy issues and supporting the governor's agenda and lobbying Congress and interacting with the federal executive, to all of a sudden becoming a disaster, response center. The government of Puerto Rico as a whole was essentially shut down. Electricity was shut down across the island. Our entire telecommunications infrastructure was shut down. For several days, it was just anyone who wanted to communicate had to have a satellite telephone to be able to do that. So, from one moment to the other, our office became the only entity in the entire government of Puerto Rico that was fully operational. So we were in direct communication with the White House, with FEMA, with, the governor, which thankfully we were able to communicate with him, but we were channeling all of his communications through our office. And we were also the recipients of an overwhelming amount of attention and requests for assistance from those 5 million Puerto Ricans that live stateside that were, worried sick about their, 3 million family members on the island. They were calling, no one was answering, text messages were left, unanswered. And people had this huge sense of fear and desperation of not knowing what was going on. To give you an idea of the scale of what we confronted, I think in a 48-hour period, our phone system handled about 30,000 calls.
Wow.
It's insane. It's insane. So it was very overwhelming. It was disorienting. There was so much to do that it was very hard to kind of wrap your head around. And my job was basically to continue facilitating the governor's communication with, all of the pertinent federal authorities, the, FEMA, White House, Department of Defense, every other federal entity that could be brought to bear in that situation. And then also to begin outreach to Congress to let them know, hey, this just happened. The scale of devastation is unknown as of yet, but it looks like it is a total catastrophe. So that basically went on for, a few months before things started to settle down even a little bit.
Well, and it's also to, don't lose sight of the fact that as a leader or somebody trying to facilitate some kind of recovery, have also undergone, it's personally harrowing as well. And I just want to call that out because it matters, that you had to lead while also being suffering and worrying about the suffering and being concerned about the inequities already there. So I just have to say,
and that's something that cannot be underestimated. You're called forth to stand up in a moment of absolute need, but at the same time, you're a victim as well. My father was in Puerto Rico. I didn't have any communication with him. I had friends and other family members from my extended family that were also down there, people that I cared about, which I didn't know. And then, it was also traumatizing because we were at times receiving calls in our office about, live situations where, in some cases, there were, hundreds or thousands of people that were stranded in an area that was flooding immediately after the hurricane, because the hurricane passes, but the rains continue, right? The after effects are cascading, right? Some of the infrastructure begins to break down and then other things come up. And at the time, our office was the only government agency in the entire, government that was answering the phones. And, we end up getting calls patched through from Puerto Rico. I don't know how they got through, but some got through. And then, they're like, we're in this community, water's rising. It's already past the first level. Most of the people here on the roofs of their homes. We need to have like a, massive rescue like right now. And we were able to, get on the phone with the governor. He called in the National Guard and, they went and they rescued, hundreds of families, including like elderly people, people with, small children standing on the roofs of their house because the houses had been, flooded. And you're, on the receiving end of some of those calls. And, that's traumatizing. It's scary. You're, afraid that you won't be able to help them because you're this far away as well. So, dealing with that was pretty significant. And I have to say that it's taken me, years to really kind of process out some of the, post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's still things that sometimes trigger, that anxiety. Certain visuals, if I see, one of those Doppler radar images with something that looks like a hurricane approaching Puerto Rico, it gets me a little buggy.
I feel that way about, I don't know if you have it there, but we have Nixle, and
Yep.
it was going off like constantly to the point where I had no nervous system left after 2 weeks. I was like,
Yeah.
I can't have it. We get it from 2 counties because we're in Sonoma Valley, which is borders Napa County. So we get theirs and Sonoma County. So I can certainly relate to that. And I'm glad that you are very straightforward about what PTSD does last. In fact, for years after a disaster, It does affect people who are, anybody who has any kind of personal or emotional stake or experiences it or does, experiences it vicariously or the service of it. And leaders tend to not want to talk about it as much. And I always bring it up on this podcast because I think that we have a role and responsibility to be very upfront that we are human, and it is incredibly difficult to navigate.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's critically important. The psychological and emotional impact and even spiritual impact is often unaddressed. But it really does take you to the edges of your human capacity to withstand. But one of the things that if you're able to process and manage, you do end up having a much or you can end up with a much stronger sense of resiliency and capacity. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen out of the post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico, that individuals and communities learned a lot more how they were able to band together, do the things that they needed to do for themselves, and yes, get the support from the government, get the hot meals that were being flown in by FEMA, and the water that was being delivered by the Puerto Rico National Guard, yes, but who was taking care of, the grandmother that needed to like get somewhere, or the pregnant mother that needed to, go to the hospital and then leave her kids behind because she had to go and deliver. Like, yeah, who were the people that were actually going to, clean up the piles of, trees that had fallen so that you could access, a road that was a private road but led to an entire community, right? And all of those instances, what they did was, I think, open the eyes of a lot of people in Puerto Rico to the fact that, we do have the capacity to come together as communities to address our own needs, sometimes in ways that are more powerful than what the government can do for us.
I think my favorite part of disaster, which is a weird statement to make, is exactly the moment that you're talking about. That when it happens to your own community and you're sitting, we kind of sit back and we think, okay, all the people who are in charge are going to show up and they're going to take care of everything and they're going to tell me what to do. And for me, it was like on day 3 when I realized that the cavalry wasn't going to show up, that in fact, the community was the cavalry, and that
Yep.
we could get this done and not to look towards external stakeholders to save us. Like you're right. They, showed up with, showers and food. But initially we didn't have that either. So, we didn't have that for a couple of days. And so, figuring out like how, elderly people can't sleep on the floor of a gym. So, how do we solve that? We put it out on Facebook, and then people like bring you, 800 cots or whatever they have in their garage. But just the strength of community and the magic of community, that's the part that I was forever transformed by. I think you're always transformed by disaster, but what I took away from it was sort of a testament to humankind, that we are not all divided and we don't care about each other. Like we
It
will
is
do it.
literally the embodiment of that famous line. It was the worst of times. It was the best of times. Like you see the worst that, nature or, humanity can bring, but you also see just some amazing acts of, kindness, generosity, solidarity, compassion. And, for me now looking back, several years out from the disaster, I think that that's what we need to really build on in terms of our society in general, finding ways to actually support and empower communities to use that innate sense of, wanting to care for our own neighbors and, our own community members, and, find ways to channel, resources and dedicate them so that we can actually be empowered to be the authors of our own resilience in the face of future disasters, and also the authors of our own reconstruction, because ultimately, after every disaster, communities need to be rebuilt, but it shouldn't just be the powers from above that decide how that happens. There really should be a participatory process for people to engage and kind of reassess. Do we want to build back the way that we were? Do we want to change things? And if so, how can we better meet the needs of our community and achieve greater resilience in the process?
I love that so much because, in our community to community program, it's built upon the idea that communities should lead and design their own recovery. And our job is to find the leaders and say, and they can be emergent. They don't have to be official in their official capacity. They have to be trusted by the community. They have to be, have a good social connectivity. It's great. We also talk to the public sector, and we try to help them all like figure out all their lanes together and how to be collaborative so that they can design and lead their own community. So when they might say to me, oh, can you do this? And I'll be like, no, but let me teach you how to do it,
Yeah.
because I don't know your community. Like I can listen and I can give you advice and adaptable systems, but they're not prescriptive. I'm certainly not a savior. I don't have like perfect answers. I have a history of working in a disaster affected community, and I know a lot of other people who've also done it. So maybe that you can just use them as you need in order for you to design and lead your own recovery. So I love that you said that.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And, it's something that I say from personal experience, because having been in government in that, during the disaster, in the post-disaster, immediate recovery period, and then later on as the reconstruction framework was being developed, I can tell you that there are significant deficiencies in the capacity of both the federal government and state governments to actually account for the, input from the respective communities that they're developing all of these plans to rebuild. One specific example, CDBG-DR. So, obviously that's one of the biggest sources of federal funding for post-disaster reconstruction. It's incredibly flexible. It has a ton of different capabilities. But the engagement that is required by federal regulation and statute for the development of the action plans is a very shallow level of engagement. And I firmly believe that the federal government and state governments need to exercise more leadership and creativity in finding ways to have that engagement be more substantial, have more depth, but also be able to be sustained over time, as opposed to we just take one snapshot right at the beginning of when this action plan is done. You submit your comments, we respond to them in writing, we hold this perfunctory little hearing, and end of story, we're out the door, and we're going to spend however many billions of dollars.
But it takes years for that money to come too. And so the problem is it's also completely different by the time that the money actually gets there. And you have to know how to apply for it.
Yeah.
And often you have to, the immediate FEMA, some of that relief comes with a match requirement for like debris removal. So 25% has to be borne by the local entities, 75% by FEMA. A lot of times that's changed to 90-10 depending on the scale of the disaster. Yep. But just the accessibility to get the tell people what these funds are, so that, I know what they are, but not every listener is going to know what those block grants. It just occurred to me that we're going to acronym this out, but it's good to say.
Yeah, no, and that's also part of the equation. We have to, I think, as organizations like yourself, and part of the work that I do is try to decipher and decode the government structures, the programs, the different legal frameworks that are utilized in a disaster response and in a post-disaster recovery process. Because the reality is that unless our communities have a way of actually understanding and being able to access that, what ends up happening is that you have a bunch of technocrats, bureaucrats, experts, and high-paid consultants that serve as the magical interpreters for how all of this takes place. But ultimately what that does is it actually leaves out a huge amount of input that is of infinite value to the process of a recovery that is inclusive, that is actually responsive to the vision that communities have of where they want to go economically, how they want their needs met, and that, really it has buy-in. And, what I found is, politically, having worked for elected officials, there's a huge potential for backlash. Yeah, like we recovered and things got rebuilt, but, I didn't really have a say. I didn't participate in it. And, oftentimes that leaves people feeling, left out or, ignored. And, part of the recovery process, going back to kind of the emotional and psychological components, is people having the need to process their inclusion as part of resolving this massive trauma that took place. And, people want to have their voices heard. And oftentimes you'll be able to get feedback from people that have ideas that you just won't hear inside of a government office or coming from a federal agency.
And they're not going to take the time necessarily. You have to know if the federal register exists in order to find the RFIs, the requests for input on there. And that's like the first barrier. And I don't think it's intentional. Like the federal government has to have policies that govern a lot of people, but I do think there's a lot, we also serve on Canvas together, which is the National Disaster Advocacy Council for resiliency and recovery. And it's one of the things we've certainly talked about inside of that platform as well, is we would like to see more equity in disaster for all communities, especially rural communities where
Yep.
if you don't know the register exists, you might know the register exists, but then you have to have the capacity to actually go in and answer all the questions. But first you have to decipher what they're asking. And the last one that we did was on equity. And we pointed out, in our answers that these questions, like we have between Molly and I, my staffer, we have 3 undergraduate degrees and 3 master's degrees. And it took all of our education to decipher what they were asking, which that in and of itself creates gross inequities. And it wasn't
Yep.
on purpose. I understand the intention is solid, but we can do better. And I actually, now is a good time to turn to talking about post-disaster for Puerto Rico, getting caught at 2017 in the midst of, a very sort of dark time in our country, but also a time when I'm going to say this, that racism seemed to be very emboldened. And it seemed, and not only did you have the, pre-existing infrastructure problems, the inequities, we were also in a time that was very challenging for Puerto Rico. Can you talk about how politics entered into that right away and has gotten better, but not, miracle style?
Yeah. So, the fact that Puerto Rico had the major disaster of hurricanes Irma and Maria back to back, which, by the way, haven't been the only natural disasters that we've happened and that have happened in Puerto Rico. We also had a historic series of earthquakes that happened at the beginning of 2020. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic, like the rest of the country and the world, right? Which is its own form of disaster. But to give you an idea of the scale of damage, the estimated damages after Hurricanes Irma and Maria were, between 90 and 124 billion dollars, according to the experts. For the earthquakes, there were, I think, between 1 and 3 billion. So these are, pretty significant disasters for sure. And, what ended up happening for us is that it came at a time where the federal executive at that time, President Trump and his administration, they were very quick to issue the disaster declaration and immediately, begin providing resources. But what we ended up noticing was that the amount of attention that was being provided to Puerto Rico in comparison to Florida and Texas, both of them states with large electoral, college impact, was significantly different. There was, of course, all the logistical difficulties of, providing disaster assistance to the island territory. But for God's sakes, America is able to invade other countries like Afghanistan and set up secure telecommunications networks in a matter of 24 hours. Why is it that we didn't have, secure telecommunications capabilities applied to Puerto Rico for, days, if not, kind of weeks on end? So there were things like that were just very hard to understand at the time in which they were happening. And over time, we began to realize that they did have, political implications within the White House at the level of the president himself. There was a different view of, the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico and the assistance that they were worthy of.
Right.
Vis-a-vis, U.S. citizens in any other state under similar circumstances. And this is something that's been documented by a number of former administration officials that have, testified and given reports to the press about, how they heard statements made, in the Situation Room and other places about Puerto Rico that were, discriminatory in nature, and even talked about the sale of Puerto Rico, which is, something absolutely absurd.
Like a draft trade.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is not like a baseball card that you can just, throw out after 123 years. Right.
Yeah.
So, there was a lot of that. And the place where it played out most explicitly was actually in the approval of the reconstruction funding for Puerto Rico. Congress already had kind of a messy situation at that time, but Puerto Rico is one of the political chips that was used by members of Congress that didn't want to give the level of aid to Puerto Rico that was commensurate with the level of disaster that we'd had. And they didn't think that we had the need for that in their view. And it's mostly because they had their own political opinions about what Puerto Rico should be or what role it plays as part of the United States. And that was very, very intense and very challenging. And I will say that we were, for the most part, successful in overcoming that legislatively. And we got a lot of money, like a historic amount, appropriated. I would say somewhere in the vicinity of like 60 to 80 billion dollars. And that's a huge swing, but there's a number of factors that go into actually how much outlays end up going out. But then what happened is the federal executive just basically said, okay, so you got it through Congress. Fantastic. I'm just going to slow the spigot down. So it's going to drip, 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 as opposed to coming out in a way that was really, responsive to the immediacy of the need for recovery and reconstruction that Puerto Rico was confronting.
Because it was literally held back by the office, the OMB office.
That's right.
It was, I mean, and that's how we knew, is because we couldn't figure out why our funds weren't coming through at the timely rate that they were for, say, Houston. Which, so we were like, what's going on here? And then we found out that it was all being slowed down through the executive office. And ours happened to be coupled with yours, and so we were able to get it uncoupled. But I am not congratulating my our organization, anybody on this, because I think this is unfortunate for all, and it just blew our minds, the level of inequity that could be that's politics injected into disaster where it absolutely shouldn't ever be.
Well, California has Kevin McCarthy, and it has Nancy Pelosi. So it's got really high-powered allies on both sides. And I think that, part of the reason why California's aid was slowed down was as a way to punish Nancy Pelosi politically, which is, unconscionable. Because at the end of the day, the people you're punishing are, from every political stripe that you can imagine. They're on the left, they're on the right, they're independent, they're everywhere in between, but they're Americans, right? and
we're all Americans. I mean, that's the thing.
That's just wrong.
It's not right. And I will say that Kevin McCarthy has been great to our area and a good representative, and we've so I have to always point that out. And he is the one who helped us initially when our disaster happened, because the Republicans were in charge of the House. And Nancy Pelosi has remained and has always been and remains a great advocate for this area and our disasters. And behind the scenes, we see that the two of them can and do work together on these issues. And so it can be very bipartisan. It's not, a great talking point always for, some people want me to just be super, that person's bad and this person's good. But in this case, that actually had nothing to do with Congress, but I think you're right, the punishment of Pelosi, and that was coming straight from the executive office, and was not something that Kevin McCarthy did.
Yeah, in the case of Puerto Rico, at the time of the disaster, we had a governor who was a Democrat, Ricardo Rosselló, and our member of Congress, resident commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez, who was a Republican. So, we also have kind of bipartisan representation that was at the helm of negotiating what was going on with Congress and with the executive. But I think that, the overarching framework with which folks in the Trump administration, particularly some folks at the OMB, saw Puerto Rico is as a second order of priority in comparison to Florida and Texas, and that was based on their own personal political and racial biases, and I have to say that up front, because I saw it in person. It's not something that someone told me. I literally heard some of these types of comments on the phone. And I'll give you one specific example. at one point, states were submitting their proposals for what they wanted out of a disaster supplemental package. And we were told by Trump administration officials at the highest level within OMB, oh, don't submit it now. Wait till the next package comes along, and then you can submit what your request is. We, of course, ignored that. We submitted our request immediately, and of course, there was no later package. But you can get a sense of just how callous the framing was, as well as the belief that the people they were interacting with were intellectually inferior, because it was absolutely clear to us that we got to get on the train that's moving, not in some other future train that will come at some point, so that's
Yeah, I think it was feeding their makers and takers narrative.
Yeah.
And that, Puerto Rico is a mess and they've had this happen and that, but they aren't saying, oh, look at our impact on Puerto Rico historically has created their infrastructure issues, their financial issues. And this is an opportunity to actually dive in and deal with all of these things at once, because we are also responsible for them. And instead it was like, oh, they just want more from us. Like it's some sort of, American
and there were literal statements and tweets by the president, oh, this is breaking our bank or something like that. And it's just like, come on, do you see that when, Oklahoma gets hit by, tornadoes? Of course not. That doesn't make any sense.
I think California got some of those tweets too.
I know. We weren't alone on that one.
No, we weren't alone. So we have about 5 or 10 minutes left. And I think this is a good time to ensure that, I've given you the platform to say whatever you want to say, but if you could quickly go over the specific challenges in Puerto Rico related to replacing housing. About 52% of the stock was ad hoc housing prior to the disaster of Maria and Irma. So how did navigating that through, especially block grants for housing, did that show up in your conversations, or how do you account for the number of people? I'm just saying that having poor infrastructure in advance makes it very hard to sometimes account and rebuild, especially when you have something like the Stafford Act. So maybe we should go straight to that, because that also affected the electrical grid. Let's do that.
Yeah. So, the reality is that in Puerto Rico, the rate of home ownership is much higher than it is nationwide. But we do have a different kind of legal structure than in most states, because in Puerto Rico, the law is based on the old Spanish civil code, which is kind of Napoleonic law, as opposed to common law, which is what the legal basis for the law in most of the states are. And in part as a result of that, and in part because of an underinvestment in state government agencies, databases, and infrastructure, there's a huge percentage, or significant percentage, of homes in Puerto Rico that are not properly titled, and that have some issues of discrepancies in the exactitude of home ownership and things like that. So that was a huge challenge in the immediate post-disaster period, because one thing is for FEMA to come in and help put up some blue tarps, and we had literally tens of thousands of homes with the blue tarps, and for them to do kind of immediate repairs to just make the house like habitable, so you can have a roof over your head and not have your house be a complete disaster. But to go from that to like the permanent reconstruction of homes, required some of this documentation. So our CDBG-DR and some of the money that we allocated in the action plan were specifically to address and remedy some of these legal situations, so that people could end up having their full reconstruction of their home if their home was totaled by the disaster. So that's one of the approaches that we took. But there was also a whole bunch of challenges with regards to the identification of the exact parcels of property, and that all has to do with the state government property registry. So you don't really think about state government property registry as being a disaster issue, but guess what? It is. it's boring, but it's there. It's a reality. And if you don't have, some of those, state government structures properly maintained and up to date, it becomes a lot harder when you're trying to do kind of global estimates of the numbers of damage, but then also ensure that, things are properly accounted for, and where all of the properties are that you want to address. So, that was a huge challenge. We're still overcoming some of that challenge. Some of the money from the CDBG-DR is still being outlaid for those purposes. And I would say that Puerto Rico's recovery continues. It has been, slow but steady. Since the current administration came into effect at the beginning of this year, we have seen an uptick in the flow of money to Puerto Rico. A large portion of that is also because a lot of the kind of administrative deficiencies had already been addressed to make sure that all the money is deployed in a way that's accountable to federal officials. But there's still a lot more to be done, and my estimate is it'll probably be maybe another decade before we actually finish like the full reconstruction and the full utilization of the resources that we've gotten Congress to appropriate for Puerto Rico's recovery and reconstruction.
And I think one of the lessons out of Puerto Rico too was that it really highlighted how some elements of the Stafford Act are really inefficient and don't make any sense at all. And specifically the part of the Stafford Act that says you have to build back to the standard you were before. In the case of the electrical grid, because of colonialism, it was built on the other side of the island from where most of the population is. And so things like that can be addressed. Can you talk about the effect that had on the recovery? Like, because it makes zero sense.
That particular standard doesn't make any sense in the case of Puerto Rico, but I'm sure it doesn't make any sense in the case of a lot of other communities across the United States.
But nothing, it doesn't anywhere, but nothing. I mean, it's a they're trying to stop fraud, which I totally appreciate, and I thank them for that. But I think there was no better example of how it's dysfunctional than the electrical grid. For me,
basically rebuilding Puerto Rico's electric grid to the standards to which it was built, which are standards that were mostly from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, made absolutely no sense and would have left us with pretty much the same level of structural vulnerability that Puerto Rico was at before the hurricane, with the big difference that now we had more pre-staged materials to kind of prop things up, quicker, right? But what ended up happening in the case of Puerto Rico is that we actually proceeded to use, I think it's the alternate procedures, I think it's section 528, which ended up providing us more flexibility for how we rebuild, but it also comes with some risks that the jurisdiction who's selecting that particular provision takes on, in terms of the, once the cost is set for what it's going to, cost under section 528, there is no escalation potential. And if the estimate is off significantly, then the jurisdiction, choosing that basically takes on the difference. Whereas under the regular FEMA funding, you have different points at which the cost estimates can be revised and, increased depending on, what's found. So, for Puerto Rico, the additional flexibility, I think, is really important. But, how all of that plays out is also made more complex in the case of our electric grid, because Puerto Rico is also in the process of actually privatizing its electric power authority. So right now we've initiated privatization process. The company that's administering the electric power distribution system is called Luma. They came into effect in their contract earlier this year. And their challenge is to, sustain what we have to continue the rebuilding and then to invest for resiliency in the longer term. So, that's while at the same time not escalating energy prices in a way that, negatively impacts our economy. So that's a tough combo to do. We're working through that. We were able to get some CDBGDR funding specifically for the reconstruction of the electric grid and for hazard mitigation, which is also something that doesn't get talked about enough, that needs to get talked about more, because obviously it's great to rebuild, but we actually need to fortify so that in the future we have a greater resilience capacity and can mitigate against future disasters.
The way we look at it is we assume 20 really difficult years, because that's all I can handle. Like 10 to 20 years. I'm like, okay, it's just going to be really bad while we figure out our mitigations. It's also why a third of our organization is dedicated to before the fire, and is called that and it's trademarked as such, because it's such an important thing. We can't just continue to, have to respond. We can actually invest and save. It costs $1 to mitigate for every $6 of responding to a major disaster. So so I love having you on, George. What I'd like you to leave us with, like, the podcast is called How to Disaster. And, there are people who are both formally and informally in the position to work in disaster. But what's your best and highest 3 things to know about how to disaster?
I think that there's nothing that can fully prepare you for when a massive disaster hits. So, you really have to kind of dig deep in that moment to the core of your being, pull on every kind of mental, psychological, professional, spiritual, political resource that you can bring to bear to get through the actual disaster itself. And then, the second thing I would say is that it is fundamentally important to know that you're not alone, that there are other communities that have been through disaster, that they've learned some hard lessons from that, and that you have the capacity to, reach out for help. And that oftentimes other communities that have been through disaster, they've got great people willing to help walk you through, some of the challenges that are there, and how to not make some of the mistakes that some other people made. And then the last thing is that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. There may be moments when you're in the disaster and in the immediate post-disaster period where you think, I've got to get all these things done. And yes, there's a lot of things to get done, but what we have to realize is that for recovery to really happen, you actually need to sustain the effort over a long period of time. If you're burning the candle on both ends, there's only so long you can do that before you burn out. And, I had a close colleague of mine that ended up at, 30 some years old having a heart attack, right? That was a heck of a wake up moment for me, because we were pretty much the same age. We were in similar, circumstances. And, part of what I learned from that is that you have to be able to, pace yourself and sustain the effort and, recover and disaster in a sustainable way.
That's all great advice. And I love leaving on that note that, you can't, it takes so long to recover. It does. And we saw people burn out or have substance abuse issues. And it's been a good wake up call for me to, I had some of those people on the podcast who've been very open, like Pat Kerrigan, who's a local media person who really had a hard time with her alcoholism. And she had to become very public with that. And she was very courageous. And it weirdly helped a lot of other people understand, like I understood at some point that I had to slow down and move out of fight or flight.
Yep.
So, I had to learn about the vagus nerve. I had to learn to meditate. And now I just have to learn how to be consistent, because I still struggle with that. But I think it's an important thing for leaders to talk about, and not to lose sight of the fact that it is long, but you will get through it.
Exactly.
That's
right. So thank you so much, Jennifer. It's been a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join your podcast, How to Disaster. I greatly appreciate that. If anyone in your audience wants to know more about my organization and my company, it's www.mersoniagroup.com. So feel free to check us out there. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Twitter, where mostly I talk about statehood.
I follow you on Twitter. I know that. I like it. Thank you so much for being on. I really enjoyed having you on the podcast and serving with you on Canvas. So we will drop a link to Mersonia Group in the description so people can just follow that as well. And thank you so much for being on the podcast, How to Disaster.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Navigating the recovery process after a fire is challenging, particularly with the additional issues caused by COVID-19. Fannie Mae is here to help. If you live in a FEMA-declared disaster area, you can request free assistance from our Disaster Response Network. Fannie Mae, in partnership with Mori Management International's Project Porchlight, launched the Disaster Response Network in 2018. This program uses HUD-approved counselors to offer support. These counselors have been specially trained as disaster coaches. They address the challenges homeowners and renters face when recovering from a disaster. There's no charge for their services. The goal of the Disaster Response Network is to help people return to pre-disaster normal as quickly as possible. Clients are matched with a coach who work with them one-on-one throughout their recovery. In the initial conversation with clients, coaches review the status of the homeowner's recovery process, including current challenges, decisions that need to be made, and immediate long-term goals. They discuss topics like income and expenses, insurance, housing, credit or debt challenges, as well as aid or other assistance programs that may be available. This may include FEMA applications and Small Business Administration, or SBA, loans. The coach helps the client plan and prioritize the next steps for their recovery. Moving forward, the coach continues to be there for the client, reaching out to them regularly, at least monthly, but more often when needed, for up to 18 months' time. These regular check-ins provide the client the opportunity to ask questions, get help tackling challenges, and keep things moving as they work through their recovery. It's also where coaches can help identify new recovery assistance or grants that have become available, strategize new next steps for recovery, and talk through difficult decisions or priorities. One of the key ways coaches assist Disaster Response Network clients is by helping intervene when something has gone awry. Coaches will, with the clients on the line, call insurance companies to adjust their claims when costs exceed initial estimates, or call the client's creditors to request payment relief. The Disaster Response Network's approach ensures survivors have a personal financial expert working with them throughout their recovery. By helping minimize the financial impact of a disaster, survivors can recover more quickly. To get confidential disaster relief assistance, call the Disaster Response Network at 877-833-1746. Once again, that is 877-833-1746. Or visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information.